Do you believe there is systemic racism in law enforcement?
Absolutely. But it's not just in law enforcement, it's across the board. It's in housing, it's in education, it's in everything we do. It's real, it's genuine, it's serious.
When you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party comes to mind? The Republicans or the Democrats? Most people would probably say the Democrats, but this answer is incorrect. Since its founding in 1829, the Democratic Party has fought against every major civil rights initiative and has a long history of discrimination. The Democratic Party defended slavery, started the Civil War, opposed Reconstruction, founded the Ku Klux Klan, imposed segregation, perpetrated lynchings, and fought against the Civil Rights Acts of the 1950s and 1960s. In contrast, the Republican Party was founded in 1854 as an anti-slavery party. Its mission was to stop the spread of slavery into the new Western territories with the aim of abolishing it entirely. This effort, however, was dealt a major blow by the Supreme Court in the 1857 case Dred Scott versus Sandford. The court ruled that slaves aren't citizens, they're property. The 7 justices who voted in favor of slavery, all Democrats. The 2 justices who dissented, both Republicans. The slavery question was, of course, ultimately resolved by a bloody civil war. The commander-in-chief during that war was the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, the man who freed the slaves. 6 days after the Confederate Army surrendered, John Wilkes Booth, a Democrat, assassinated President Lincoln. Lincoln's vice president, a Democrat named Andrew Johnson, assumed the presidency. But Johnson adamantly opposed Lincoln's plan to integrate the newly freed slaves into the South's economic and social order. Johnson and the Democratic Party were unified in their opposition to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave blacks citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the vote. All 3 passed only because of universal Republican support. During the era of Reconstruction, federal troops stationed in the South helped secure rights for the newly freed slaves. Hundreds of black men were elected to Southern state legislatures as Republicans, and 22 black Republicans served in the U.S. Congress by 1900. The Democrats did not elect a black man to Congress until 1935. But after Reconstruction ended, when the federal troops went home, Democrats roared back into power in the South. They quickly reestablished white supremacy across the region with measures like black codes, laws that restricted the ability of blacks to own property and run businesses, and they imposed poll taxes and literacy tests used to subvert black citizens' right to vote. And how was all of this enforced? By terror, much of it instigated by the Ku Klux Klan, founded by a Democrat, Nathan Bedford Forrest. As historian Eric Foner, himself a Democrat, notes, in effect, the Klan was a military force serving the interests of the Democratic Party. President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, shared many views with the Klan. He resegregated many federal agencies and even screened the first movie ever played at the White House, the racist film, The Birth of a Nation, originally entitled The Klansman. A few decades later, the only serious congressional opposition to the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 came from Democrats. 80% of Republicans in Congress supported the bill, less than 70% of Democrats did. Democratic senators filibustered the bill for 75 days until Republicans mustered the few extra votes needed to break the logjam. And when all of their efforts to enslave blacks, keep them enslaved, and then keep them from voting had failed, the Democrats came up with a new strategy. If black people are going to vote, they might as well vote for Democrats, as President Lyndon Johnson was purported to have said about the Civil Rights Act. I'll have them voting Democrat for 200 years. So now, the Democratic Party prospers on the votes of the very people it has spent much of its history oppressing. Democrats falsely claim that the Republican Party is the villain, when in reality, it's the failed policies of the Democratic Party that have kept blacks down. Massive government welfare has decimated the black family. Opposition to school choice has kept them trapped in failing schools. Politically correct policing has left black neighborhoods defenseless against violent crime. So when you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party should come to mind? I'm Carol Swain, professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University for Prager University. Thanks for watching.
Sam Battle was a hell of a guy.
In 1911, when Sam Battle was sworn in, he was the first
Black hired by the NYPD.
As I left headquarters, the commissioner told me I was appointed and talked to me personally. And he said to me, "You will have some difficulties, but I know you will overcome them."
Imagine the difficulty of becoming a police officer in the 1900s.
You have to put yourself back in the time.
Not only were African Americans dealing with injustices racially, we had our own internal battles.
It wasn't just that he was the first black that made him historically significant. He was, in my view, he was the real deal.
I went by the Grand Central Terminal, where I worked as a red cap, to see the station master and all the boys. All the red caps stopped carrying the bags to see the first black policeman in greater New York.
Yes, he faced a lot of racial tension. Yes, he faced bigotry. Yes, he faced, injustices.
He made it in spite of this, major discrimination.
His actions demonstrate his willingness to sacrifice himself.
And when the streetcars would pass, the motormen and conductors would clang the bells, and the conductor would say, "Look over there at New York's first colored policeman."
This migrant from the South, he comes to Harlem and he walks up the steps on 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, the subway station, and there is this black police officer directing traffic. And he goes, "This must be heaven." They have a black police officer.
It was about him making a difference, him bringing something to the community.
It gave people hope, people in Harlem hope.
First black sergeant, first black lieutenant, first black parole commissioner. The doorway was opened. He was a pioneer and a trailblazer.
Good old Mayor LaGuardia. He loved Sam Battle. When Lou Gehrig died and Sam had retired, he appointed Sam to Lou Gehrig's place on the parole commission.
LaGuardia said, "I'm making Battle parole commissioner not because he's a Negro, because he's the best man that I know in the city of New York of the position to which I'm appointing him. He's perfectly, absolutely qualified for it."
He knew the journey would go on for him and for his people and for society.
I've seen the Negroes grow in the police department. We have captains, many lieutenants, and sergeants all over the city of New York. We've come a long way.
He would see tremendous, tremendous progress.
The racial components are changing dramatically. This is truly becoming the mosaic of law enforcement departments. It's really starting to reflect the communities from which it's policing.
He would be proud.
It's just a beautiful thing.
He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1912, son of a black Army officer whose career was badly stunted by segregation. He attended West Point, where he believed his classmates would accept him because of his character and not his race. He was wrong. For 4 years, he was shunned. He despised segregation and was determined to destroy it. He was turned down for flight training because there were no black flying units. When blacks were finally allowed to become flyers, he was their commander, and they were the Tuskegee Airmen. Under his leadership, the men of the 99th Pursuit Squadron and the 332nd Fighter Group became renowned for never losing a bomber they escorted to fight or attack, a feat unmatched by any other group. With World War II behind him, he took up a new fight to destroy segregation within the military. He won that battle too. He went on to serve with great distinction, became the first Air Force black general officer, and saw his dream of an integrated Air Force and a more tolerant nation come true.
He's an American. He's an American who contributed to the victory in World War II. He's an American who contributed to the victory in all the wars after that. He's an American who contributed to whatever we gained during the Vietnam War through his command of the 13th Air Force. He's an American.
His name is Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., and he is a legend of air power.
What we try to do with Wall Builders Collection is present America's forgotten history and heroes. One of our forgotten heroes is the guy who wrote this letter. His name is Hiram Rhodes Revels. That's usually not a name that we think of immediately, but we should. He is one of the original black congressmen. This is Hiram Rhodes Revels right there. He's the first black U.S. senator. Now, the story of how he became a senator is interesting, but before we get there, Hiram Rhodes Revels was a gospel minister. He was with the black denomination, AME denomination. He was also with the Methodist Episcopal denomination. He also raised 2 regiments of black soldiers in the Civil War, one regiment out of Missouri, one regiment out of Maryland. He ran a Christian newspaper, very strong Christian man, but he was elected to the legislature of Mississippi in about 1868, 1870. But he became a U.S. Senator in an interesting manner. This man is named John Roy Lynch. He's one of the early black congressmen that served. He also was in the Mississippi legislature. He also was a Republican. And he said what made Hiram Rhodes Revels a U.S. Senator, our first U.S. Senator, was that he was asked to open the Mississippi legislature with prayer. He did. And he said the prayer was so good that they elected him to the U.S. Senate. I wonder what the Senate would look like today if we chose our U.S. Senators based on how they prayed.
You talk that's all. You loser! Try to run people over! Get him out of the street! Get him out of the street! He's dead, dog!